In this video, I'm going to show you the 54 best and most interesting European cities to visit, and we'll go from cheapest to most expensive. The most famous ones are more towards the end, but there are some real amazing places that are very cheap towards the beginning as well. Here we go. Same as the last few years, Kyiv in Ukraine is the cheapest destination in Europe, and surprisingly enough, there are still a few hostels open and a few foreign tourists. I wouldn't recommend it for the time being, but at least your average daily expenses should only be around $36.32. By the way, the most expensive city on the list is about 4.5 times as expensive, so this is a real bargain. Sofia, Bulgaria is a really nice if unspectacular capital city, and it is still super cheap, so it would only cost you about $38.85 per day. It's a bit out of the way though, so getting there isn't as easy as it could be. The prices mentioned in this video include a hostel dorm bed, 3 budget meals a day, and a few other things, so under $40 is pretty cheap. Next up is Bucharest in Romania, which is another one that is a bit out of the way for most tourists, but at least you can get through a day for $39.85 and live it up as well. Okay, so here's the first one on our list that is actually a really cool city that would be worth visiting even if it cost way more than the $41.02 per day that Budapest, Hungary does. Budapest is also out of the way, but it looks like a really important place because it has been in the past, and it's got these gorgeous thermal springs right in the middle of the city that are even popular with tourists. Put Budapest on your list if you haven't been there yet. Sarajevo in Bosnia is even more remote than the others, and you can visit for about $46.91 per day. It's a gorgeous place set in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, and the most interesting thing about it is that it's got a huge mosque right in the middle of town, so it's very popular with Muslim tourists from Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. There's not much to say about Zagreb, Croatia, aside from the fact that it's the country's capital and that the majority of tourists to the country prefer the beach cities that are coming up later in the list. At least it's cheap at only $48.52 per day. Here's a real gem that most people have never heard of, even though it's the second busiest tourist city in Czechia. Cesky Krumlov is a gorgeous storybook town of only about 13,000 residents with a castle and a serpentine river running through town. A day here will cost less than $49, and it's only 3 hours from Prague. Kind of similar to Sofia, Belgrade in Serbia is a nice enough city that would be fun for 2 or 3 days, but there aren't really any notable sights here, so I don't really recommend it. A day here for a budget traveler costs only $49.58, so it's got that going for it, which is nice. Krakow is the next real gem on this list, and it's still wonderfully cheap as well. It's a gorgeous town that used to be the capital of Poland, and it's got a cool castle right in the historic walled part of the city. I would highly recommend Krakow even if it cost more than $51.49 per day. By the way, I'm Roger from priceoftravel.com, and these prices are all based on our Backpacker Index, which we have been producing annually since 2011. The price includes 1 night in a hostel dorm bed, 3 meals, 2 public transportation rides, 3 alcoholic drinks a day as an entertainment fund, and 1 major sightseeing attraction each day. So in all of the cities so far, you get all of that for $40 or $50 per day, but the ones at the end of the list cost 3 or 4 times as much. Riga in Latvia is another one of those pleasant capitals of a small country with no major sights. The Baltic region is all really nice and quite affordable still, but I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who hasn't explored most of the great cities in Europe first. A day here goes for $53.27. Warsaw, at $55.46 per day, is the current capital of Poland, and it looks and feels a lot more of its communist legacy than Krakow does. There's one really nice part of town that was authentically rebuilt after it was flattened in World War II, but not much else to see. If you have time for only one city in Poland, make it Krakow. Coming in at $56.02 per day, Bratislava in Slovakia is another pleasant capital city on the Danube, but I wouldn't rush to get there. Like so many of these, it's nice and you'd enjoy a visit, but it doesn't really stand out compared to so many others on the list, including Vienna, which is only an hour away. Vilnius is the capital of Lithuania, and it's the only one of the 3 Baltic capitals that isn't on the sea, so it doesn't have the cheesy cruise passengers like the other 2 do. Again, it's nice looking and very affordable at $61.04 per day, but save it for later. Bonus points for finding the Frank Zappa statue in a random parking lot. The last of the three pleasant and cheap Baltic capitals is Tallinn in Estonia. It's similar to the other two, except there are a lot more Finnish tourists here because it's only a 90-minute ferry ride from Helsinki, and alcohol costs about half as much. A day here can be yours for $62.81. Thanks for hanging on this far, because almost every city from here on out is worth a visit, and many of them are still pretty cheap. Istanbul in Turkey is truly one of the world's most important capitals, and since it straddles Europe and Asia not far from the Middle East, it's unlike anything else anywhere. They've had some issues in the last decade, including inflation and a plummeting currency, but I'd still highly recommend a visit at $65.01 per day. Naples is definitely the grittiest of Italy's big cities, and it had been known almost as much for petty crime as for being the birthplace of pizza, which is amazing there, by the way. It's still cheap at only $65.21 per day, and it still has almost no green space, but tourism here is booming and people are booking hotels instead of just doing day trips from Sorrento or the Amalfi Coast. It's worth a look. Tenerife is the largest of Spain's Canary Islands, which are just off the coast of northern Africa, and they're all pretty similar and pretty cheap at $65.31 per day. They're known far more for a pleasant year-round climate than for sightseeing. Northern Europeans love to come here in winter when it's miserable at home, kind of like South Florida in North America. I wouldn't bother on your first few trips to Europe. Another hidden gem is Ljubljana in Slovenia at only $67.08 per day. It's a charming little city at the edge of the mountains, and it doesn't really get much tourism considering how nice it is. Better still, Slovenia has some of Europe's best and most interesting scenery, so easy day trips will be unforgettable with small crowds as well. The first of the two major coastal cities in Croatia, Split is much less famous than Dubrovnik, and it's also much cheaper at $67.71 per day, and in some ways it's even more interesting. It's also much less crowded with cruise passengers, so I recommend it as your first stop in the country. Prague in Czechia is still fairly affordable, and it's still an amazing place to visit even though the main tourist corridor can feel absurdly crowded in the summer months. It's one of Europe's architecture highlights because so many of its unusual buildings somehow survived the World War II bombings. Prague is definitely in my Europe top 10, and it's one of the cheaper ones as well at $68.43 per day. Malta is a small and fascinating group of islands just south of Sicily that were once run by England, so English is widely spoken. The tiny capital is Valletta, and it's got some really cool sights, but nothing amazing, and honestly most of the visitors come here because it's pretty cheap at $69.27 per day, and they have mild weather most of the year. Now we're getting into the mid-priced European destinations, and Athens in Greece still provides good value at $72.08 a day, considering it has several world-class sites and history dating back to the beginning of Europe itself. I think 3 days here is enough to enjoy the main things, and then consider heading out to one of the Greek islands if you're visiting in the warm months. More about them coming up. Speaking of great value, Portugal is the cheapest of the Western European countries, and its capital, Lisbon, has some of the nicest weather on the continent. Coming in at just under $75 per day, it's really lovely, and things here seem about 10 or 20% cheaper than the big cities in Spain, so it feels like a bargain. Since it's at the edge of the continent, it's a bit out of the way, but very worthwhile. Speaking of Spain's big cities, Madrid is the capital, and it's right in the middle of the country. It's got a royal palace and some world-class museums, but Barcelona with its beaches is now a bit more popular. Still, at $78.10 per day, Madrid is a must-see in the area and highly recommended. Greece has dozens of popular holiday islands, and Santorini is the most popular and usually the most crowded. At $82.60 per day, it's not too expensive, and the other islands are mostly a bit cheaper as well. But Santorini is one of those places that many visitors regret visiting, especially if a cruise ship is in town, because the place is overwhelmed. Research the other islands for a better and cheaper experience. Berlin is still probably the coolest big city in Europe because of the way that things worked out when Germany reunified in the early 1990s. It doesn't have too many amazing sights, but it has a fascinating vibe unlike anywhere else, and it's still pretty affordable at $82.81 per day. Berlin is highly recommended, especially for young people and those interested in the arts. Bruges is a charming coastal town in Belgium that looks a lot like a mini Amsterdam, which makes a lot of sense when you read about the history. It's cheaper at $85.31 per day and less crowded than Amsterdam as well, and it's easier to find the craft beer that Belgium is so famous for. The aptly named Nice is the largest town on the French Riviera, and it's the perfect place to base yourself to explore the area, including Cannes and Monaco, which are each only 20 minutes in either direction by train. It will cost $87.60 per day on our index, but it'll be a bit more expensive and much more crowded in July and August, so I'd avoid those months if possible. By the way, these daily prices are for a typical day for a backpacker staying in hostels. If you have 2 people sharing a 3-star hotel room, it will cost a bit more than this per person, and we actually have a separate Europe 3-star traveler index. That said, the order of the cities is almost the same, so even if you need a bit more money to stay in hotels, this list still shows the cheap ones, the mid-priced ones, and the expensive ones just the same. Speaking of expensive ones, up to about 5 years ago, Stockholm and Copenhagen were always near the bottom of this affordability list, but hostels and hotels have actually come down in price, and now they are somewhat affordable. Stockholm comes in at a lucky $88.88 per day, and it's absolutely gorgeous to match so many of its residents. Some things like alcohol and public transportation are still very expensive, but it's not a budget buster anymore. Until Berlin's resurgence, Munich had been Germany's most popular destination for tourists, partly because of that whole Oktoberfest thing, and that it's the capital of the Alpine Bavarian region that so many cliches about Germany are based upon. Munich is still a very pleasant and reasonably affordable city at $89.06 per day, but it doesn't actually have too many blockbuster sights. By a tiny amount, Hamburg is Germany's most expensive big tourist city, and it's one of the richest cities in Europe as well. This is one of Europe's big port towns, so there are some sites that are related to that. Of course, the Beatles thing still draws in crowds, but otherwise Hamburg doesn't get much attention from those outside of Europe, even at under $90 per day. Starting around 1992, when Barcelona hosted the Summer Olympics, it gained in popularity and is now Spain's tourism powerhouse. The architecture here is unlike anything anywhere else in the world, and Barcelona is one of Europe's big highlights, but especially in summer, it's now so crowded that locals are rebelling and making visitors feel unwelcome. A day here should cost you $90.99. Dubrovnik is Croatia's version of that, with its gorgeous walled city in its heart that feels more like a theme park than a place to live. This is a big Game of Thrones location as well, and that has added to the cruise passengers most days. It's incredible to see in person, but I'd still prefer Split just a little up the coast as it's cheaper and much less crowded. You can expect to spend $92.29 per day. Compared to most of the other cities in this price range, Helsinki in Finland is a bit of a dud. It's nice looking and pleasant, but there are no major sights and it feels expensive for what you get at $92.38 per day. Perhaps the most overlooked place in its region is Luxembourg City in Luxembourg. It's an extremely rich city thanks to its banks, but prices here still seem reasonable, and it's a quirky little place that is worth a short visit. It's surrounded by Germany, France, and Belgium, and definitely worth a look for $92.50 per day. Vienna is currently the capital of Austria, and it used to be the capital of an empire, so it's another one that looks and feels very important. It's got castles and palaces and opera houses all in or near the city, although not much nightlife. Pastry fans will also love it here, and it will seem worth the $93.15 per day. Amsterdam used to be my favorite city in Europe, and I even lived there for a time, but then it kept getting more expensive and more crowded at the same time, which is a bad combination. It's still absolutely stunning and unique, and you have to see it in person, and fortunately some hotels and hostels have come down in price recently as well. A day here will cost you $94.68 as a backpacker, but quite a bit more if you need a central hotel room. Another of my favorite European cities is almost as beautiful and way less crowded. Copenhagen in Denmark feels like a perfect city if you visit in the summer when the sun sets at 10 p.m. and the weather is warm. It's also become a bit cheaper recently, and $95.10 per day feels well worth it. Brussels in Belgium is overrated in my opinion, and I've been there quite a few times. The central square is gorgeous, but most of the city is built for bureaucrats and international organizations, and there isn't much to see for tourists once you've taken your photo of the mannequin piss a couple blocks from the main square. It's also pretty expensive at $95.52 per day. The remaining cities on the list would have to be in the expensive camp, and it's a bit surprising that Dublin in Ireland is one of them because it used to be fairly cheap. Dublin is a nice enough place and the Guinness Storehouse is worth a visit, but I actually recommend exploring the rest of Ireland instead of lingering here for $98.54 per day. Even if you haven't seen the Sound of Music movie, you should try to make it to Salzburg in the Austrian Alps. It's pretty compact and absolutely gorgeous, with a historic town center filled with classical music concerts and especially the scenic hills around the area. Highly recommended and worthwhile at $98.60 per day. Ibiza is an unusual one on this list, since the main attractions are the mega nightclubs and the beaches in summer without much else to see or do. Prices here are similar to the other Balearic islands of Spain, and they are the highest in July and August when they are all packed. Outside of high season, you can expect to pay around $98.75 per day, and that doesn't include nightclub admission. Milan is Italy's banking capital and fashion capital, but it's actually not a great tourist city, and it's not even very Italian because it was part of Austria not all that long ago. The Last Supper and an amazing cathedral are here and worth a look, but otherwise your time in Italy is better spent elsewhere at just under $100 per day. Some people pronounce the Scottish capital as Edinburgh and some as Edinburgh, so let me know in the comments which one you use. This is Britain's second most popular destination, and it's definitely worth visiting if you have time for anything beyond London. It's got a bunch of cool attractions all bunched into one area called the Royal Mile, so it's easy to visit in 2 or 3 days, and it'll cost you about $101.49 per day. Rome is always kind of chaotic, and some of it feels like it is falling apart, so it actually feels a bit expensive at $104.43 per day. That said, Rome has some of the world's greatest tourist attractions like the Colosseum, Ancient Rome, and the Vatican Museum, so it's good that it doesn't actually cost more than that because you should visit at least once. In my opinion, Paris absolutely lives up to the considerable hype, and it's also good that it only costs $109.28 per day because everyone should visit ASAP and you'll want to come back. The whole central city is beautiful and most sights are amazing. Perhaps better still, the food is unbelievably good even if you're just buying a baguette sandwich from a corner shop. Even the cheap wine is good and it's cheap. The fjords in Norway are some of Europe's best and most unique natural scenery, and the gateway to the fjords is the city of Bergen. Everything here is expensive at $111.54 per day, but at least it's clean, pleasant, and the quality is high for hotels and hostels. They also have mediocre food here and you won't believe the prices. Similar to Helsinki, Oslo is a mostly pleasant Nordic capital city that doesn't have many unique or interesting sights, and it feels incredibly expensive at $115.24 per day. If you only have time for one stop in Norway, make it Bergen instead. Florence in Italy has usually been at least a bit cheaper than Rome, but recently its hostels and hotels have jumped up in price, so it's near the bottom of this list. This is the capital of Tuscany, so the history and the food are both world-class, and it's a bit frustrating that a day here will go for $115.83. You should absolutely go to Iceland as soon as you can and probably minimize your time in its capital, Reykjavik. The country is easily among the most beautiful and unusual places on Earth, and if you have a week to spare, you should rent a car and drive a lap around the ring road for an unforgettable experience. Reykjavik itself is really expensive at $123.84 per day and kind of a dud compared to the actual cities on this list. If you visit, you'll see what I mean. Now way up in the big leagues, London needs no introduction, and it will cost $125.73 per day on our Backpacker Index. You can actually find decent deals on hostels and family-run hotels, but the attraction prices here are insane even compared to Paris and Rome. London should be on your list, and with any luck the British pound will stay low like this, and that helps when visiting. Venice in Italy has actually been a tourist city for going on 400 years now, and there's nothing else like it in the world. A few other cities have more canals, but none look like this. It's understandably expensive at $126.31 per day, and fortunately it's compact enough that you can visit in just a day or two. I recommend paying a bit more to stay on the main island because most of the cruise passengers and day trippers are only there from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m., so it's way less crowded before and after that. Switzerland is arguably Europe's most beautiful country, and the Interlaken area is the most beautiful part of Switzerland. Specifically, the Lauterbrunnen Valley area just to the south is where you'll want to stay and focus your attention. Everything in Switzerland is expensive, even compared to its next-door neighbors, but at least Interlaken is worth it in spite of the $128.58 daily price tag. Last, and in some ways least, the most expensive tourist city in Europe is Zurich in Switzerland. Similar to some of the others, it's an attractive city on a lake, so you'd be impressed if you visited, but there's almost nothing to see. Zurich is built for bankers and watchmakers and business people on expense accounts, and everything costs more than it should. A day here will run $163.94, and it's not even close to being worth it. Avoid the big cities in Switzerland, and you'll have an amazing time there. Thanks for watching to the end, and please give the video a like and subscribe to see more videos about how much things cost around the world.